1247, July 30th, 1943. 6,000 meters above Kassel, Germany. 24-year-old Staff Sergeant Michael Arous of the U.S. Army Air Forces, huddled in the cramped tailgun turret of the B-17 bomber Tondelayo. His left arm was soaked in blood, the shrapnel gash still oozing steadily. Warm blood trickled down his arm and into his frigid flight suit, crystallizing into tiny shards of ice in an instant within the turret's bone-chilling -50°C air. The left machine gun beside him was completely destroyed. A direct hit from a German 20mm cannon round had ripped through its barrel, warping the weapon into useless scrap metal. A snapped ammo belt lay strewn across the floor, and frigid shell casings clattered with sharp, jarring clinks as they rolled around the turret with every jolt of the aircraft. Aruth had no time to tend to his wound. With his only functional right arm, he braced hard against the sole remaining .50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun, his finger resting on the trigger, his gaze locked unblinkingly on a German FW-190 fighter screaming toward him from 700 yards dead ahead. Over the aircraft intercom, the crew's frantic shouts, the deafening thuds of cannon shells slamming into the fuselage, and the non-stop rattle of gunfire from every defensive position merged into a single, chaotic roar. The skies over Europe were engulfed in the flames of war, and the shadow of death was creeping inch by inch up the frigid fuselage of this battered flying fortress. He glanced down at the ammo box, where the red counter read clear as day, only 63 rounds left. Every single round held the fate of the Tondelayo in the balance. Every single round held the lives of all 10 crew members on board. No one could have imagined that this ordinary tailgunner, grievously wounded and dangerously low on ammunition, was about to single-handedly stand against the ferocious onslaught of more than 300 German warplanes. Even fewer could have foreseen that the heavy machine gun in his hands, with just 63 rounds remaining, was about to completely upend the U.S. military's long-held air defense doctrine and rewrite the rules of aerial combat across the entire Western Front of Europe. Trapped alone in the most dangerous post on the bomber, this young man was about to kick off a bloodied, wounded battle that would etch his name into the history of aerial warfare. To understand the legend of Michael Arous, we must first travel back to the Western Front in 1943, to the darkest hours when U.S. bomber formations were hunted down without mercy by German fighter pilots. In 1943, World War II had reached a fever pitch. On the Western Front in Europe, the U.S. Army Air Force's 8th Air Force emerged as the core spearhead, striking directly at Germany's domestic industrial heartland and crippling Nazi Germany's war-making capability. The absolute backbone of the 8th Air Force at the time was the B-17 four-engine heavy bomber, known far and wide as the Flying Fortress. This rugged aircraft boasted a maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds, a service ceiling exceeding 10,000 meters, and 13.50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns mounted in all-around defensive positions across the entire airframe. Top U.S. military brass were convinced that this dense web of self-defense firepower would make the bomber the indestructible flying fortress they had envisioned. But the seemingly indestructible B-17 was facing a catastrophic survival crisis in the skies over Europe in 1943. In the first half of the year, the 8th Air Force's bomber combat loss rate skyrocketed to between 12 and 15%. On average, for every 100 bombers sent on a mission, 12 to 15 were shot down by the Germans. With 10 crew members aboard each bomber, this meant that every deep strike mission into German territory ended with hundreds of U.S. airmen killed in action or taken prisoner. Two key factors led to this devastating tragedy. The first was the critical range limitation of U.S. escort fighters. The U.S. military's primary escort fighters at the time, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning had a restricted combat radius. They could only escort the bomber formations as far as the German border, and once the bombers pushed deeper into German territory, they were left completely without escort, reduced to sitting ducks for German fighters. The second was the U.S. military's long-cherished, yet hopelessly outdated air defense doctrine, which German pilots had fully deciphered and turned into a fatal flaw for hunting down American bombers. At the U.S. military's official gunner training manual contained one ironclad rule. All bomber gunners were forbidden from opening fire until enemy aircraft had closed to within 300 yards. The core logic of this rule was to conserve ammunition, reserve sufficient firepower for close-quarters defense, and maximize hit accuracy while minimizing ammo waste by firing at close range. This doctrine, which seemed impeccable in peacetime training, exposed a fatal flaw the second it was put to the test in real combat. Through countless aerial battles, German pilots had learned the U.S. military's tactical rules inside and out, and they exploited this loophole with ruthless precision. They adopted preemptive long-range strike tactics, opening accurate cannon fire on U.S. bombers from 600 yards or even further away. By the time American gunners finally reached the 300-yard firing threshold, many bombers had already taken critical hits, sustaining severe airframe damage and heavy crew casualties, leaving them completely unable to mount an effective counterattack. The B-17's tailgun position, meanwhile, was the most isolated and dangerous post on the entire aircraft, with a mortality rate second only to the ball turret on the bomber's underside. The tailgun turret was unbearably cramped, with only enough space for a single gunner to huddle inside, no extra room to move at all. Gunners were often forced to hold the same position for 8 to 10 straight hours at high altitude. At altitudes above 6,000 meters, temperatures plummeted to -50 degrees Celsius. Even in a full insulated flight suit, a gunner's hands and feet would freeze stiff, leaving them with sluggish movements and at risk of permanent, irreversible frostbite. Even more fatally, the tailgun turret was completely cut off from the rest of the crew, with no contact beyond the intercom. If the turret came under attack, the gunner could not receive any support, forced to face the test of life and death completely alone. There was no heating in the turret, and oxygen supplies were limited. Many gunners would grow dizzy from oxygen deprivation, or even lose consciousness entirely. The turret was also packed with hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and oxygen hoses. If struck by cannon fire, these would easily ignite a fire or trigger an explosion, leaving the gunner with almost zero odds of survival. It was in this post, where death was far more likely than survival, that 24-year-old Michael Arous was assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 8th Air Force's 379th Bombardment Group, taking his place as the tail gunner of the B-17 Tondelayo. Aruth was born into a working-class family in Pennsylvania, USA. He had no military experience prior to enlisting and had never even touched an aircraft machine gun before. Like countless other young American men hastily drafted into service at the time, he was thrown straight into the hellish cauldron of the European battlefield after just a few months of crash course training. During his training, he had strictly followed the official manual, drilling close-range shooting over and over and mastering ammo conservation techniques. But it didn't take long for him to discover that these armchair tactics were nothing short of a death sentence in the brutal reality of aerial combat. In June 1943, Aruth flew his first bombing mission aboard the Tondelayo, targeting a tank factory in Germany's Ruhr industrial region. Once the bomber formation pushed deep into German territory, the escort fighters were forced to turn back due to their range limits. Moments later, swarms of German Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters closed in fast like a ravenous pack of wolves. Sticking rigidly to the official doctrine, Aruth fought back every urge to open fire, waiting until the enemy planes closed to within 300 yards to squeeze the trigger. But in the time he spent waiting, a neighboring B-17 took a precision hit from a German fighter. The aircraft erupted into a raging inferno, forcing its crew to bail out, only to be strafed at low altitude by German fighters during their descent. None of them survived. Aruth watched this tragedy unfold before his very eyes. He watched German fighters calmly line up their shots and open fire from 600 yards out. He watched American bombers plummet from the sky, one after another, trailing thick plumes of black smoke. And all the while, bound by the 300-yard firing rule, he could do nothing but take the onslaught, completely helpless to fight back. That bone-deep sense of powerlessness planted in him a complete and total doubt of the official doctrine that had cost so many men their lives. After the mission, the Tondelayo limped back to base, its fuselage riddled with shrapnel and bullet holes. Aruth did not pause to rest. He sought out his crew commander at once and leveled his question. Why must we wait until enemy planes get within 300 yards to fire? Why are we surrendering the chance to defend ourselves early just to save ammo? The answer the commander gave him was identical to the one written in the training manual. This was official regulation, vetted and approved by high command. Ammo was conserved to be used in the most critical moments, and only close-range fire could guarantee hit accuracy. But Aruth pushed back on the spot, voicing the core creed that would define his entire career in aerial combat. Dead men don't need reserve ammo. If we wait until 300 yards to fire, most of us won't live long enough to take that shot. The ammo we save means absolutely nothing. From that day forward, Aruth began secretly developing an entirely new combat tactic. He cast aside the official training manual entirely and began experimenting with long-range firing. He used every break between training exercises and combat missions to drill his shooting technique at ranges of 700 to 800 yards, meticulously documenting bullet trajectories and hit accuracy at varying altitudes, wind speeds, and aircraft attitudes. He quickly made a critical discovery. While long-range fire had a lower per-round hit rate and consumed more ammunition, the tracer rounds from the .50 caliber heavy machine guns formed a vivid, unmissable red stream of fire high in the sky. Even if that stream did not strike the enemy aircraft directly, it delivered an intense psychological shock to German pilots, forcing them to take evasive action before they could establish a stable firing line. This completely disrupted their attack runs, prevented them from landing precision hits on the bombers, and achieved the defensive objective indirectly. Aruth's tactic was backed by crystal-clear mathematical logic. He calculated it time and time again. A German FW-190 fighter launching an attack from 600 yards out needed a minimum of 10 seconds of steady, level flight to line up a shot and land a critical hit on a B-17. In those 10 seconds, if an American gunner opened fire early and laid down sustained suppression with tracer rounds, the German pilot would inevitably have to change his flight path to evade, instantly losing his firing window, and even veering completely off his attack course. It was true that each long-range suppression burst might burn through dozens of rounds to drive off a single enemy plane. But compared to the cost of a bomber shot down and all 10 crew members lost, the price of that ammunition was negligible. Aruth often said to his fellow gunners, "Better to spend your ammo firing back and buy yourself a chance to live than to hoard it and wait to be shot down. Survival is the only thing that matters." But Aruth's unorthodox tactics soon triggered a tidal wave of skepticism and ridicule. The ground crews were the first to voice their frustration. Aruth was burning through more than twice the ammunition of any other gunner on every mission. The standard 1,200-round ammo load for a B-17's tail guns, which was more than enough for other crews to complete an entire mission, was often exhausted by Aruth halfway through a sortie, drastically increasing the ground crew's workload. Squadron officials went even further, bluntly stating that Aruth was openly defying military orders and disregarding official doctrine, branding him a reckless madman. Some even went to senior command with a proposal to reassign him from the tailgun position and bring disciplinary action against him. In the face of all the doubt and mockery, Aruth did not waver an inch. He remained firm in his belief that combat was the only true test of a tactic. Early July 1943, the Tondelayo was assigned to a bombing raid on Hamburg, Germany. The moment the escort fighters turned for home, more than a dozen German Bf-109 fighters closed in fast. This time, Aruth did not hesitate for a second. He squeezed the trigger the instant the enemy planes reached 750 yards out. Both .50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns roared to life, their tracer rounds carving two blazing red streams through the high-altitude sky, straight for the German warplanes. The German pilots, mid-stable firing run, were caught completely off guard by the oncoming wall of fire. They instinctively wrenched back on their control sticks to climb and evade, and every cannon round aimed at the Tondelayo sailed harmlessly into empty sky. Aruth did not let up. He continuously adjusted his firing angle, laying down a relentless stream of suppressive fire, and in the chaos he forced one German fighter to veer so wildly off course that it slammed directly into another enemy plane attacking a neighboring bomber. Both aircraft instantly spiraled out of control and crashed in flames. On this mission, the Tondelayo successfully fended off wave after wave of German attacks without escort protection, sustained only minor damage to its airframe, completed its bombing run, and returned to base safely. The three neighboring B-17s, which had strictly adhered to the 300-yard firing doctrine, were all shot down by German fighters. None of their crew members survived. This battle was the first time all those who had doubted Aruth began to take a second look at his ammo-wasting tactic. The ground crews still grumbled about his rate of ammo consumption, but they could not deny that this seemingly reckless approach had pulled the Tondelayo from the jaws of death time and time again. Over the next several missions, Aruth continued to use his long-range suppression tactic, fending off German attacks again and again. The Tondelayo's survival rate dwarfed that of every other bomber in the group, making it one of the lowest loss aircraft in the entire 379th Bombardment Group. His tactic was refined and perfected with every combat mission. He gradually mastered the core skills of long-range shooting, learning to pre-calculate his aim point based on the flight path of German fighters, lay down precision suppression with tracer rounds, and even land critical hits on enemy aircraft at ranges of 700 yards. His confirmed kill count climbed steadily, from 0 on his first mission to 1, 2, 3, until he slowly became a well-known gunner in his squadron. While senior command still held some who doubted his tactics, the Tondelayo's unbroken record of safe returns was his most powerful proof. But what truly made Aruth a legend, what sent shockwaves through the entire 8th Air Force with his revolutionary tactics, was the Great Kassel air raid of July 30th, 1943. It was the bloodiest, most harrowing battle of his career, and the defining fight that would completely rewrite the U.S. military's air defense doctrine. On July 30th, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched a massive bombing raid on the city of Kassel, Germany. The primary target was the local FW-190 fighter manufacturing plant, the core production facility for Nazi Germany's FW-190 warplanes. Destroying it would directly cripple the Luftwaffe's frontline combat strength and tear open a gap for subsequent bombing campaigns. For this operation, the U.S. military deployed 183 B-17 bombers, split into 3 formations, carried out jointly by the 379th, 305th, and 91st Bombardment Groups. Aruth's Tondelayo, part of the 379th Bombardment Group, was positioned in the center of the first formation, tasked with covering the formation's left flank. At 8:30 a.m. that day, The 183 B-17s took off in sequence from RAF Kimbolton in England, the formation flying in tight formation toward Kassel, Germany. The weather was clear on takeoff, with excellent visibility, and P-47 escort fighters flanked the formation on all sides. Everything proceeded with perfect order. By this point, Aruth was already sealed in the tailgun turret, clad in his full flight gear, having inspected both .50 caliber heavy machine guns and filled the ammo boxes to capacity. He huddled in the cramped turret, his eyes scanning the surrounding sky with unwavering vigilance, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, ready for any sudden threat. The sub-zero cold in the turret had long since numbed his cheeks, hands, and feet, but he did not let his guard drop for a second. Countless combat missions had taught him, the calmer the moment, the closer the danger. At 11:15 a.m., the bomber formation reached the German border. As planned, the P-47 escort fighters, constrained by their maximum range, formed up and turned back to base. The 183 B-17 bombers were now completely stripped of escort protection, lambs separated from the flock, flying alone deep into German airspace toward Kassel. Every nerve in Aruth's body tensed. He knew the true test of life and death had begun. At 12:30 p.m., the bomber formation was just 50 kilometers from Kassel. German air defense radar had locked onto the American formation's position long before, and swarms of Luftwaffe fighters were scrambled from airfields across the region, a pack of wolves catching the scent of blood, hurtling straight for the U.S. bomber fleet. At first, only a few dozen German planes were in the fray, but as the minutes ticked by, more and more joined the intercept, until the force reached a staggering 300-plus aircraft. 200 Bf-109s, 100 Fw-190s, and a number of twin-engine heavy fighters armed with 200 10mm air-to-air rockets, forming an overwhelming intercept force. The German fighters deployed an all-out attack strategy. A portion launched head-on assaults from the formation's 12 o'clock position, exploiting the B-17's weak forward firepower to strafe at close range. Others closed in from the sides and below, targeting the bomber's wings and fuselage, aiming to take out engines and fuel tanks. Some even carried 250-kilogram bombs, diving on the bomber formation from high altitude and dropping their ordnance, treating the massive B-17s as aerial bombing targets. In an instant, the high skies became a blood-soaked hellscape. Boom, boom, boom! The 20mm cannons of a German fighter struck a B-17 on the edge of the formation with pinpoint accuracy. The fuselage erupted in thick black smoke, 2 of its engines destroyed instantly. The powerless bomber plummeted toward the ground like a kite with its string cut. Some of the crew on board didn't have time to bail out. Those who did were strafed at low altitude by German fighters during their descent. All were killed. Moments later, several more B-17s were hit in quick succession. Explosions, the roar of machine guns, and the sickening shriek of tearing metal merged into a single cacophony 10,000 meters in the sky. The scene was one of utter devastation. It was not long before the Tondelayo, Aruth's aircraft, was locked onto by a German fighter. An Fw-190 came screaming in fast from the starboard rear quarter, the distance closing with terrifying speed. Aruth did not hesitate for a single moment. He squeezed the trigger the instant the enemy plane reached 780 yards out. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Both heavy machine guns roared to life in unison, 2 blazing red streams of fire streaking straight for the incoming fighter. The German pilot, mid-targeting run, was caught completely off guard and immediately hauled his aircraft into a steep climb to evade. Every cannon round he had aimed at the tail turret sailed wide, leaving the Tondelayo completely unscathed. Aruth did not let up on the trigger. He continuously adjusted his firing angle, his stream of fire locking onto the enemy plane's flight path, forcing it into constant evasive maneuvers that made an effective attack impossible. But in the split second he was focused on the enemy fighter to his right, another Bf-109 slipped in silently from the port lower quarter, launching a surprise strike directly at the tailgun turret. Boom, boom, boom. Rounds from a 20mm cannon ripped straight through the port side wall of the tail turret in an instant, sending shards of shredded metal flying in every direction. Shrapnel sliced deep into Aruth's left arm, blood erupting from the wound in an instant. A sharp, guttural grunt escaped him from the searing pain, and all strength drained from his left hand, leaving him unable to grip the machine gun's handle any longer. Worse still, the port-side heavy machine gun had taken a direct cannon hit. Its barrel was warped and mangled. The ammo belt snapped clean in two, rendered completely useless on the spot. Of the entire tailgun position, only the starboard machine gun remained operational. Aruth glanced down at his left arm. Blood had already soaked through his flight suit, and the skin around the wound was rapidly turning purple from the extreme cold. A sickening mix of numbness and searing, tearing pain threatened to overwhelm him, but he knew with absolute clarity that he could not fall. The tailgun position was the Tondelayo's final line of defense. If it fell, the entire crew would be doomed. He clenched his jaw, bit open the seal of his first aid kit with his teeth, and using only his uninjured right arm, quickly applied a pressure bandage to the wound on his left arm. The hasty treatment would only stem the bleeding temporarily, doing nothing to ease the agonizing pain, but he had no time to spare. He braced his body hard against the sole remaining .50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun with his right arm, shifting his entire weight against the weapon, and locked his gaze back onto the German fighters closing in ahead. That was when he glanced down at the ammo box, and the red counter stared back at him in stark black and white. Only 63 rounds left. Just then, a Bf-109, taking advantage of the brief window while he dressed his wound, had closed to just 500 yards and launched an attack on the Tondelayo's fuselage. Cannon rounds slammed into the airframe in quick succession, sending out deafening, thunderous booms. A gaping hole was torn in the wing, the hydraulic system was damaged, and the entire aircraft began to shake violently. Aruth did not hesitate for a second. He squeezed the trigger instantly, and the machine gun unleashed a furious, staccato roar. This time, he did not opt for wide-area suppression. Instead, he locked his aim dead on the enemy fighter's cockpit, firing controlled, precise bursts. Crack-a! Single .50 caliber round sliced clean through the enemy fighter's cockpit canopy, killing the German pilot instantly. The out-of-control Bf-109 stalled in an instant, plummeting toward the ground before erupting into a fireball high in the sky. It was the first enemy plane Aruth had shot down on this mission, his first kill single-handed after suffering grievous wounds. But the battle was far from over. More and more German fighters closed in around the Tondelayo. With incredible willpower, Aruth operated the gun with one hand, laying down sustained, long-range suppression at ranges between 700 and 800 yards. The red stream of tracer rounds acted as an invisible barrier, driving back German attack runs time and time again. His shooting was precise and decisive. Every burst forced enemy pilots into evasive action, and every so often, he landed a crippling hit on a vital part of their aircraft. Before long, another FW-190 attempted to close in from dead astern. Aruth pre-calculated its flight path, adjusted his firing angle, and opened fire at 720 yards out. His tracer rounds struck the fighter's engine with pinpoint accuracy. The engine immediately billowed thick black smoke, and the now powerless German fighter was forced to break off and head for home, ultimately crashing inside German territory. It was the second enemy plane he had shot down. By this point, only 13 rounds remained in the ammo box. Aruth grew even more methodical. He ceased blind strafing entirely, holding his breath and waiting for enemy planes to enter his optimal firing window before squeezing the trigger. Just then, a German twin-engine heavy fighter, armed with rocket launchers, launched an attack on the Tondelayo, two rockets screaming straight for the fuselage. Aruth immediately adjusted the gun's angle, firing a continuous burst along the rocket's flight path. Rat-tat-tat! Several rounds struck one of the rockets dead on, detonating it prematurely high in the sky and sparing the Tondelayo from the impact. But shrapnel from the explosion ripped through the tailgun turret once more, slashing into Aruth's right arm, and blood began to flow again. Wounded in both arms, perilously low on ammunition, trapped in an isolated turret with no support, and facing the onslaught of hundreds of German fighters, Aruth did not back down an inch. He braced himself against the machine gun, his gaze still scanning the surrounding sky with unwavering vigilance. Soon, a third Bf-109 closed in. Learning the lessons of the first two downed fighters, it did not charge straight in, but circled continuously at 600 yards, hunting for an opening to attack. Aruth held his breath, waiting with cold patience. The moment the German fighter adjusted its angle to open fire, he squeezed the trigger, sending the final 10 rounds in the gun screaming straight toward the enemy plane. 3 of the rounds struck the fighter's fuel tank with deadly precision. With a deafening explosion, the fuel tank detonated, the entire aircraft engulfed in flames as it plummeted toward the ground. It was the third German fighter Aruth had shot down in this battle, using the very last of his ammunition. By this point, the last of the rounds in the gun had been completely exhausted. Aruth set down the machine gun, leaning back against the frigid metal wall of the turret, gasping for air. Tearing, agonizing pain radiated from the wounds on both his left and right arms. His face was deathly pale, his body ice cold, and he had drained nearly every last ounce of his strength. But he did not collapse. He held himself upright, his gaze still locked unblinkingly on the sky outside the turret. Even without a single round left to fire, he would stand his post at this final line of defense. Just then, the American bomber formation finally arrived over Kassel. The bombardiers pressed their release switches, and a hail of bombs poured from the bomb bays, streaking straight down toward the FW-190 fighter factory on the ground. Deafening explosions ripped across the landscape, one after another, thick plumes of smoke and flames surging skyward. The German fighter factory was completely engulfed in fire, and the bombing mission had been successfully completed. The bomber formation banked around and began the return flight to base. The German fighters' intercept attempts did not cease entirely, but after hours of brutal, sustained combat, the Luftwaffe formation had also suffered devastating losses. A number of their fighters, their fuel tanks running dry, were forced to turn back, and the intensity of the intercept dropped dramatically. Though the Tondelayo had sustained severe damage to its airframe, a crippled wing, and a failing hydraulic system, the crew worked in unison to keep it airborne, setting a course for their base in England. For the hours-long flight home, Aruth never left his post in the tailgun turret. Even without a single round of ammunition, he maintained a vigilant stance, scanning the skies around him for any surprise attacks from German fighters. At 17:30 that afternoon, the Tondelayo finally touched down safely at RAF Kimbolton in England. When the crew hatches were opened and the crew carried Aruth out of the tailgun turret, he had slipped into unconsciousness. The wounds on both his arms had become severely infected after hours without proper medical care, his frigid flight suit riddled with shrapnel holes and caked with dried blood. Every single person on the airfield that day was left stunned by what he had endured. In the Great Kassel air raid, the American bomber formation successfully destroyed the FW-190 fighter factory in Kassel, taking out 3 aircraft production lines and 27 grounded fighters on the ground, dealing a crippling blow to the Luftwaffe's manufacturing capacity. In the battle, the U.S. military lost 22 B-17 bombers, with 220 crew members killed in action or taken prisoner. The Luftwaffe lost 89 aircraft, with 107 pilots killed. But it was Aruth who emerged as the battle's most remarkable hero. Trapped in a hopeless situation, wounded in both arms, fighting with a single gun, and perilously low on ammunition, he had shot down 3 German fighters and successfully protected the Tondelayo and every single member of its crew. Aruth's heroic actions in the Battle of Kassel quickly spread through the entire 8th Air Force, and his long-range suppression tactic finally caught the attention of senior U.S. military command. The 8th Air Force's Tactical Research Department immediately launched a full after-action review and in-depth study of Aruth's tactics. They collected combat data from every one of Aruth's previous missions, compared it to data from gunners who had strictly adhered to the official 300-yard doctrine, and reached a staggering conclusion. Bombers with gunners using Aruth's long-range suppression tactic had a survival rate over 60% higher than those following the 300-yard rule. Though ammunition consumption had doubled, the combat loss rate for bombers had plummeted, and crew survival rates had seen a transformative improvement. The data told an undeniable story. In the first half of 1943, the 8th Air Force's average bomber combat loss rate sat between 12 and 15%. For bombers using Aruth's tactics, that loss rate never rose above 5%. Take the 379th Bombardment Group, for example. Under Aruth's influence, more and more gunners adopted the long-range suppression tactic, and the group's average monthly bomber losses plummeted from 8 aircraft to just 2, with crew fatalities dropping by 70%. These ironclad numbers completely invalidated the official doctrine's core reasoning and provided irrefutable proof of the effectiveness of Aruth's tactics. The ground crews and squadron officials who had once doubted Aruth completely reversed their stance. Though the ground crews still had to load far more ammunition for his missions, they knew with absolute clarity that this ammo-wasting tactic saved more bombers and brought more young crewmen home alive. Squadron officials were forced to concede that the air defense doctrine the U.S. military had clung to for years had long been outmatched by the realities of combat, and that Aruth's long-range suppression tactic was the true path to survival in the Western Front's aerial battles. In August 1943, the 8th Air Force held a dedicated tactical symposium, inviting Aruth to attend in person, deliver a detailed breakdown of his long-range suppression tactic, and share his hard-won combat experience. At the symposium, Aruth used the minute-by-minute details of the Battle of Kassel to break down the tactic's core logic, operational techniques, and real-world combat effectiveness. His presentation received unanimous acclaim from the attending officers and tactical experts, and countless gunners in attendance vowed on the spot to learn this life-saving tactic and abandon the long-outdated official doctrine. Following the symposium, the 8th Air Force immediately used Aruth's tactics, paired with real combat data, to develop an entirely new set of gunner training regulations, and began rolling out the long-range suppression tactic on a trial basis across multiple bomber groups. During the trial period, the U.S. bomber combat loss rate dropped even further, cementing senior command's resolve to roll the tactic out across the entire force. In November 1943, the United States Army Air Forces issued an official order completely revising its air defense doctrine. It abolished the ironclad fire only within 300 yards rule and officially recognized and rolled out Aruth's active defense tactic across the entire force. The new regulations laid out explicit requirements. All bomber gunners were authorized to open long-range suppression fire the moment enemy aircraft entered the 700 to 800-yard range, prioritizing deterrence via tracer rounds to disrupt enemy attack runs and protect the safety of the bomber. Ammunition conservation was no longer the core rule. Instead, maximizing crew survival was enshrined as the #1 objective. The revision of this doctrine completely altered the fate of U.S. bomber formations and rewrote the entire aerial combat landscape of the Western Front in Europe. In 1944, with the full rollout of Aruth's active defense tactic, the 8th Air Force's bomber combat loss rate plummeted from 12 to 15% in 1943 to below 3%. The average monthly number of bombers lost dropped from more than 30 to fewer than 10, with crew survival rates rising by over 80%. At the same time, the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe's interception operations collapsed dramatically. German pilots could no longer exploit the loopholes in U.S. doctrine to carry out calm, long-range targeting runs. Instead, they were forced to contend with long-range suppression from American gunners, and their loss rates continued to soar. In May 1944, the P-51D Mustang, a fighter with greater range and superior performance, entered active service. This aircraft was capable of providing full escort coverage for bomber formations, and when paired with Aruth's active defense tactic, it delivered a transformative leap in the survivability of U.S. bomber groups. Step by step, the U.S. military gained complete air superiority over the Western Front in Europe. In the first half of 1944, the Luftwaffe had nearly exhausted its entire corps of elite pilots. Of 2,395 active-duty pilots, 2,262 were killed, severely wounded, or taken prisoner. The replacement rookie pilots had an average of just 80 hours of flight training, making them completely unable to stand against British and American pilots with an average of 225 flight hours under their belts. Nazi Germany's aerial defense system was irrevocably headed for total collapse. As for Aruth, after months of medical treatment following the Battle of Kassel, his injuries gradually healed. He did not choose to retire and return home. Instead, he went back to the Tondelayo, resuming his post as tail gunner to continue flying bombing missions. In the operations that followed, he continuously refined his tactics, and his confirmed kill count climbed steadily, ultimately earning him a place among the most successful bomber gunners in U.S. military history by number of enemy aircraft shot down. In September 1943, Aruth flew with the Tondelayo on a bombing mission over Stuttgart, Germany. It would be his final combat mission. Stuttgart was a core industrial hub of Germany and a critical Nazi air defense stronghold, protected by an immense number of anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft, with an impenetrable defensive network. The target of the mission was the local VKF ball bearing factory, a linchpin of Germany's military-industrial complex. Its destruction would paralyze Germany's production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. At 9 a.m. that day, 338 B-17 bombers took off from their bases in England and set course for Stuttgart. For this mission, the P-47s were once again only able to escort the formation to the German border, and once the bombers pushed deep into German territory, they were once again thrust into the peril of flying without escort. Aruth took his post in the tailgun turret as always, inspecting his weapons and filling his ammo boxes to capacity. Forged by the crucible of the Battle of Kassel, he had grown calmer and even more decisive. At 11 a.m., the bomber formation arrived over Stuttgart, only to be met by a sudden bank of thick, heavy cloud cover, resulting in extremely poor visibility. This created immense difficulties for the bombing mission and perfect conditions for surprise attacks by Luftwaffe fighters. German anti-aircraft guns on the ground opened a relentless barrage into the sky, with flak rounds exploding continuously around the bomber formation, creating walls of black, deadly smoke. The formation was forced to constantly adjust its altitude to evade the onslaught. At the same time, more than 100 German fighters, using the cloud cover for concealment, launched a surprise attack on the American formation. The German fighters employed a stealth attack tactic, creeping in under the cover of the clouds and holding their fire until they closed to within 500 yards, catching the Americans completely off guard. In just a few minutes, multiple B-17s were hit and plummeted from the sky, trailing thick black smoke. Every nerve in Aruth's body tensed instantly as he scanned vigilantly through gaps in the clouds for any sign of German fighters. Just then, an FW-190 suddenly burst through the clouds, launching an attack directly at the tail of the Tondelayo. Rounds from its 20mm cannon struck the tailgun turret in quick succession, piercing the hull. Shrapnel slammed into Aruth's chest and leg, inflicting grievous wounds once more. Blood erupted from his body in an instant, and he crashed to the floor of the turret, the machine gun slipping from his grasp. At the same time, the Tondelayo's fuselage was hit multiple times. One of its wings was blown clean off, multiple engines were damaged, and the hydraulic system failed completely. The entire aircraft began to spiral out of control, plummeting rapidly toward the ground. The crew commander immediately issued the order to prepare to abandon the aircraft and bail out. But by this point, the plane was completely uncontrollable, making the jump extraordinarily dangerous. Compounding the risk, German fighters were continuously strafing at low altitude, turning any crew member who bailed out into little more than a living target. In this life-or-death moment, with incredible willpower, Aruth struggled to his feet and picked up the machine gun from the floor. The searing pain in his chest and leg felt like a knife slicing through him with every movement, but he did not back down an inch. He squeezed the trigger with every ounce of strength he had left, firing continuously at the approaching German fighters. Tracer rounds streaked through the clouds, driving back enemy attack runs time and time again, buying the crew precious seconds to bail out. But the aircraft's loss of control only worsened, its altitude dropping by the second, with no hope of recovery. The crew commander had no choice but to issue a second, mandatory order to abandon the aircraft. Only when he watched the last of the crew jump from the plane did Aruth set down the machine gun and prepare to bail out. But by this point, his leg was so badly wounded that he could not stand at all. He could only drag his injured limb, crawling with agonizing slowness toward the escape hatch. The moment he prepared to jump from the hatch, a German fighter closed in once more, opening fire with a strafing run directly at the escape hatch. Aruth spun around instantly, squeezing the trigger with the last of his strength. His rounds struck the enemy fighter's cockpit with pinpoint accuracy, sending the plane spiraling out of control and crashing to the ground. But Aruth was also hit again by shrapnel from the explosion, slipping into unconsciousness as he fell from the hatch into the open sky. Fortunately, Aruth was falling over waters near the English Channel. Though his parachute had been torn by shrapnel, it still deployed successfully, slowing his fall. He ultimately plunged into the English Channel, where he was picked up by an American rescue vessel that arrived shortly after. Every single member of the Tondelayo's crew, protected by Aruth's covering fire, bailed out successfully and was rescued. Not a single man was killed. Once again, Aruth had traded his own grievous injury to give every one of his brothers in arms a chance at life. After the Battle of Stuttgart, Aruth's injuries were so severe that he could never fly a combat mission again. He was transferred to a U.S. military hospital in England for long-term treatment. In this battle, he had shot down one more German fighter, cementing his final confirmed kill count at 17 aircraft. This earned him his place in U.S. World War II history as the undisputed ace gunner of the Bomber Corps. In March 1944, to recognize Aruth's extraordinary acts of heroism, the United States Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, DSC, the second highest honor the U.S. military can bestow upon a soldier, second only to the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "In the hopeless situation of being grievously wounded, with one machine gun destroyed and the aircraft's oxygen system disabled, he remained steadfast at his post, shooting down 4 German aircraft in succession, demonstrating unparalleled courage and devotion to duty. This honor belongs not only to him personally, but to the entire 8th Air Force and the entire United States Army Air Forces. In addition, Aruth was awarded the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the Air Medal, and numerous other decorations in recognition of his extraordinary contributions during World War II. Many assumed that after recovering from his wounds, Aruth would choose to retire and return home. But he made a decision that surprised everyone. He would remain in the Air Force, using his hard-won combat experience to train new bomber gunners and spread the life-saving active defense tactic he had pioneered. In the second half of 1944, after recovering from his wounds, Aruth was transferred to a U.S. Army Air Force's gunner training base to serve as a full-time instructor. He passed on every single bit of his combat experience to wave after wave of new recruits, holding nothing back. He taught them the core techniques of the long-range suppression tactic, how to stand their post in the unforgiving extreme cold of high altitude, and how to deliver maximum combat effectiveness with limited ammunition. He also took part in writing the U.S. military's brand new gunner training manual, formally integrating his tactics into the U.S. military's official training system, allowing countless more gunners to break free from the constraints of outdated doctrine and survive on the battlefield. After the end of World War II, Aruth did not retire and continued his service in the United States Air Force. He served as an instructor at multiple air bases, took part in the ongoing optimization and refinement of the U.S. military's air defense tactics, and trained a large number of outstanding bomber gunners for the U.S. military. His active defense tactic not only reshaped the aerial combat landscape of the Western Front in World War II, but was also widely adopted and adapted by air forces around the world in numerous local wars in the post-war era. It became the core logic of bomber self-defense tactics, shaping aerial defense doctrine for decades to come. In 1962, at the age of 43, Michael Arous formally retired from the United States Air Force due to health issues, bringing his 20-year military career to a close. After retiring, he returned to his hometown in Pennsylvania, where he lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke to others of his legendary exploits in World War II, and seldom gave interviews to the media, living out his twilight years just like any ordinary man. In 1990, Michael Arous passed away due to illness at the age of 71. His life was both ordinary and extraordinary. He never held a high-ranking commission, nor did he lead earth-shattering military campaigns. He was simply an ordinary gunner, trapped in the tail turret of a bomber. Yet with his hard-won combat experience, he challenged the outdated, authoritative doctrine of his time. With his courage and unwavering resolve, he saved the lives of thousands of crew members aboard thousands of bombers. With his entire life, he embodied the eternal truth that genuine knowledge comes from real combat. What he left to history was never just a combat record of 17 enemy aircraft shot down. It was an active defense tactic that completely rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, and a spirit that refused to blindly follow authority, feared no criticism, dared to root itself in real combat, and had the courage to break boundaries and innovate. His story teaches us this: true heroes are never just the generals who map out strategies from behind the lines. They can also be ordinary soldiers, standing fast at their unassuming posts, using their courage and wisdom to protect their brothers in arms and rewrite the course of history. True truth is never the armchair doctrine written on paper. It is the lessons forged in the blood and fire of real combat, the lessons that truly solve problems and save lives. In war, doctrine is rigid, but people are not. Only by refusing to follow blindly, fearing nothing, daring to break new ground, and having the courage to stand your ground, can you hold on to the chance of life and claim victory in the cruelty of war. Michael Arous lived this truth with every fiber of his being for his entire life. His legend will be forever etched into the monument of World War II history, inspiring generations to come to hold fast to their convictions and march forward with courage. That's all for today's episode. If you love military history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. See you in the next one.